Good morning, everyone. We are in Mishna Harah, Perek Gimel, Chapter 3, Mishna Ches, Mishna 8. I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shlomis Rabinowitz, Shlomis Bas Rav Yaakov Eliezer. Okay, Hanoitel Sa'ar Meisa, one who takes sourdough from a dough, Shlo Hurma Chalasa, the chal was not separated from it. The Noisin L'Seich Isa Shurma Chalasa, and he mistakenly put it into a dough that its challah was separated. Okay, so sourdough. What is sourdough? Sourdough is made by leaving dough to ferment. It is added to regular dough in order to make it rise. That's sourdough. So our Mishna is talking about where the sourdough was taken from a dough that challah was not separated from, which means it needed its challah separated from it. And it was mistakenly put into a dough that challah was already separated from, which means that what we have right now is a mixture of dough that is tevel, dough that challah has not been separated from, and it's gotten mixed into a dough that challah already was separated from it. Now, this case didn't have to be sourdough into the dough that challah was separated from. It could have been dough that challah wasn't separated from. They got mixed into the dough that challah was separated from. But this is the common case of how that could happen. Okay, now, first thing is that when this sourdough gets mixed into the other dough, really, we should say, according to Torah law, that the dough should become batal, should become nullified in the dough. Meaning, when you have the majority of non-tevel dough, and you have a minority of tevel dough, you've got more of the dough that challah was separated from than the sourdough that challah was separated from, and now it's mixed into it. It should become batal. It should become batal b'roiv. It should become nullified in the majority. That was what Torah law would say here. And according to Torah law, everything would be fine. You wouldn't have to do anything. But the rabbis instituted that if any amount of tevel gets mixed in a situation where we have two of the same thing, two of the same kind, sourdough and dough are considered the same min, the same kind, the same species. And therefore, when min b'minoi, when one of a kind get mixed into each other, there the Chacham Seicha said, like in this case by the tevel, where you have the dough that challah wasn't separated from into the challah was separated from, it's not going to become nullified. And therefore, we have to deal with this mixture. Now, the thing is like this. So if we have the mixture of the sourdough in this dough, meaning the sourdough that's tevel, challah wasn't separated from it, into the dough that challah was separated from, so why not just, so separate challah from the sourdough and everything will be taken care of, right? The answer is, the problem is they got mixed in a way that you can't identify the sourdough anymore. So that's not an option. Well, maybe there's another option. Maybe the other option is actually, as we said, this sourdough came from a dough the challah wasn't separated from. So separate challah from that dough that the sourdough came from for the dough and the challah. That should be possible to do. Bring them near each other, and you'll take care of it like that. The answer is, the reason that's not an option is because, as we mentioned, the sourdough, according to Torah law, is really batal, it's really nullified. It's only according to rabbinic law that it needs challah to be separated from it. The original dough was full-fledged challah. That had a Torah obligation to separate challah from it. And the rule is, if you want to separate from one dough for another, they both have to be of the same level. You can separate from one dough for another dough when both of them have a Torah obligation for challah. Or you can separate from one dough for another dough when they both have a rabbinic obligation for challah. In our case, the original dough has a Torah obligation. The sourdough that got mixed in only has a rabbinic obligation, and therefore I cannot separate from the original dough, from the dough that the sourdough came from, for it. So what do you do? So Mishna says like this. If he has flour from somewhere else, which means he has flour from somewhere else, and he can make that flour into a dough. What he's going to do is he's going to now combine that with the sourdough, and then he's going to take out challah according to the proportion of how much dough that needs challah separated from in comparison to the challah, in comparison to the dough that challah doesn't have to be separated from. So that means like this. So as we said, you have the sourdough that needs challah mixed into the dough that challah is separated from. So I take flour, if I have it, I take flour, I make it into a dough. And then what I do is I'm going to make sure I'm getting this right. Right. You're going to go ahead and take that dough. Right. We're going to take that dough, that new dough that we made. It's going to touch the dough with the sourdough mixed into it. That's going to combine them together. We had a Mishna like that before. And so now that the sourdough and the new dough that both need challah separated from them have combined together, so now I can take off challah from that new dough for the sourdough. Now, how much am I going to have to separate? The Mishnah says, lefi cheshbon, according to proportion. Meaning, I only have to separate challah from the dough that needs challah taken from it, not from the dough that challah was taken from. So if I make this combination of the two, and now it comes out that a third of this entire mixture is tevel, meaning it's the new dough plus the sourdough. I know how much sourdough fell in, and I know how much I have of the new dough, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, well, a third of this whole conglomeration of dough, right, is tevel. So I'm going to take off challah, let's say 1/24th, if it's being baked for private use, from that proportion of tevel that's in this whole combination. If it's a third, I'll take off 1/24th from that third. Now, what's important to know is like this, and this is what the commentaries speak out, that when we talk about this if you have flour from somewhere else and you're making a new dough, this flour that you're making the new dough from has to have a specific amount to it. Specific in the sense of, as we have learned, that the amount of dough, or the amount of, a dough will have a obligation of challah separated from it if it comes from 1/4 kav of flour. That's the dry measure of flour that you need. When you make a dough out of that flour, that dough now has an obligation of challah. You don't want that much in this case. You don't want to have the new dough having its own obligation of challah. That's because if you do that, so then what you have is we're trying to go ahead and combine the two, right? We're trying to go ahead and combine this, see it as one unit, so that I can separate from one for the other. I'm going to separate from the new dough for the sourdough. But that's a problem. The sourdough, as we said, is only rabbinically obligated. The new dough has a Torah obligation. So I'm going to go back to the original problem that I had before, which is I cannot separate. Like what the question was before, why not separate challah from the original the sourdough came from? The answer is because the original dough the sourdough came from had a Torah obligation for challah, and the sourdough had a rabbinic obligation. Well, that's what you got to have again. The purpose of touching them together is so that they could be seen as one, so that I can separate from one for the other. But it's still one for the other. Okay, and therefore, if the new dough has a Torah obligation and the sourdough has a rabbinic obligation, I can't separate from one to the other. Therefore, the new dough has to come from an amount of flour that's less than 1/4 kav, meaning on its own it wouldn't have an obligation of challah. It would have an obligation of challah. But now that it's combined together with the sourdough, now together they will have the amount, meaning I have the flour that I'm making the new dough from is less than 1 1/4 kav. It has no obligation whatsoever. Now I combine it together with the sourdough. Now I have my 1 1/4 kav. Now I have my chal obligation. But that chal obligation is going to be of the same level, because the only reason the new dough is now obligated in challah is because it connected with the sourdough, and the sourdough is only rabbinic an obligation, and therefore it's only going to be rabbinic an obligation. Now they're at the same level. Okay, you take one for the you can take from one, and it can count for the other. If it's going to come from 1 1/4 kav, then this dough itself is an amount that it has an obligation for challah, and the sourdough doesn't have a Torah obligation for challah. So therefore, I have to make sure that the new dough that we're combining together, so that I can take off challah for the sourdough from the new dough, it has to be that the new dough doesn't have an obligation on its own at all. It only gets an obligation because it became connected with the sourdough, and therefore its level of obligation is going to be the same with the sourdough, a rabbinic obligation, and therefore I can separate the challah from the new dough to cover the sourdough. Okay, so now that's all if you have the ability to make this new dough. Vim lav, the Mishnah concludes, but if you don't have any more flour, you have nothing more you can do. Maitzi challah achas alakol, you take off one challah for the whole thing, meaning when I have this mixture of the sourdough that was tevel together with the other dough that challah was separated from, and I have this mixture. When I don't have that option because I have no other flour to make more dough, I will actually look at the entire dough as if it needs challah, and I'll separate my amount of challah, let's say 1/24th, I'm using it privately. I'm going to separate it from the entire dough. In the first case, I can just do it according to the proportion of how much tevel, how much dough that's not challah has been taken from is part of this mixture. I can't do that now. And therefore, the way I have to separate the challah is look at the whole thing as if it's tevel and take off an amount of challah based on this entire dough being considered as if it's considered, have this entire dough considered as if it's tevel. And then when I separate the challah from it, it will cover the amount of sourdough that's mixed in. Okay, we are in the laws of Lashon Harah, Klal Yud, chapter 10, from the Chavetz Chaim, Sifa, paragraph 6. There are times where you can tell over the Lashon Harah to others, and even if the person involved doesn't know. We have been saying until now that in all the cases where you are aware, you know that someone wronged another person, and based on that, there would be, if all the conditions are fulfilled, you would be able to tell others about it. So the Chavetz Chaim until now said it before the previous paragraph and the footnote before, that if the person who was damaged, he was the person who was stolen from, or the person that Lashon Harah was spoken about, we said that if he doesn't know about what happened to him yet, you shouldn't go telling others about it, because then if others relate to him what so-and-so did to him or said about him, that would constitute mechilas. So now the Chavetz Chaim says, but there are times where you would be able to tell others before the victim knows what happened to him. And that is that by telling others, even before he knows that he will definitely have gain from it, then you can do it. Without any question, the 7 conditions that were mentioned before have to be met here. But the point is that we can have a case where, until now, we're saying that if he doesn't know about it, you're relating it to others, it could turn into rechilas. Now we're going to say, don't be concerned about that. So the Chavetz Chaim says, I'm going to elaborate now. I'm going to give an illustration so that nobody makes a mistake about this. For instance, if you now recognize the nature of this person, who, let's say the case was, you heard this person speaking Lashon Harah about somebody else, okay? Now, you know the nature of that person who has been speaking Lashon Harah about someone, And according to the story that's being told by him, that just as he put this other guy down in front of you, meaning a very basic case would be, how do you know that someone spoke Lashon Hara about someone else? The answer is he came over to you and told it to you. Okay, he told it to you. Now, you recognized him and this story that the same way he came over to you to badmouth this person, he's going to move on from you and tell others about it. All the more so if one of the conditions before to tell it to others was that you approached the sinner, you rebuked him, and he still didn't listen. So we're in a situation where this guy is not holding by repenting for speaking Lashon Hara. And we know very well, unfortunately, we all stumble in speaking Lashon Hara, all the more so when it comes to accepting Lashon Hara from others. And therefore, if this person now goes on and tells others what he said to you, it's a good chance it's going to be accepted by others. And it's going to be very difficult to convince them otherwise in the future, to try to convince them not to accept what was said. Because the phrase goes, the first one in the quarrel, he's the one who's considered right. Basically, the first one to make his claim, people accept that as the truth. And therefore, it's better that you preempt that person and approach those people first. And lay out what a bad thing this person speaking Lashon Hara about someone is. You got to tell other people this guy is bad mouthing him for no reason. So that when now this person who told you the Lashon Hara now goes and tells them about it, they won't accept what he said. And the more so, they'll rebuke him for it. Like, what are you talking about? Now, this guy who's speaking Lashon Hara, if he sees that other people don't accept what he says, not only that, he's basically people are looking down at him for it. He won't continue doing this. In all this case, in this kind of situation, it's for sure permissible to go ahead and tell others before the victim knows what happened to him, because then he will definitely save this person from any more shame or anguish. The same thing also. He'll save the one who's speaking the Lashon Hara and the one who would be potentially hearing the Lashon Hara from the punishment of Gehenna, because they will then not accept the Lashon Hara, and this guy may stop speaking the Lashon Hara. He'll also be fulfilling the positive commandment of Eichacha, rebuking if it comes out that through what you said to others, he'll stop doing it, because they're going to rebuke him for it. They're going to tell him why you're doing this. And therefore, in this kind of situation, the advantages that will come out are greater than the disadvantage that could come out if the person finds out about it, because that victim will definitely clearly gain from this, from you telling others, and therefore that is what you would do in this kind of case. Have a wonderful day.